Hi, this is Laura from Healing with Spirit. We are here with Dr. Jessica Taylor for our next episode of Triggers in Spiritual Medicine, where these are episodes where we have real talk. We address the elephant in the room to the growing sickness of our society, address the root issues, and provide sustainable solutions. We hope by addressing the intersectionality and connecting the dots like a web of many of society's challenges, we hope others can understand the trauma infection that impacts all areas of our life, including addiction, domestic violence, racism, homelessness, sexual abuse, chronic health issues, cancer, environmental issues, climate change. I mean, we can make a list and go on. In these episodes, we also address a certain trigger while offering the spiritual medicine with at least 3 tips or actionable steps that our listeners can take and implement today. We just ask that this is all a collaboration effort, that you share, you like, you comment, you engage, all that, because with visibility, we share the messages, we share the medicine, and we gain traction to create a better, more sustainable life, planet, and world. So welcome, Dr. Jess Taylor. Oh my God. Like, I think I first learned about you during the Amber Heard trial. I think that's when I first came across you.
Mm.
And I was like, yes, like she gets it. Because I, and it was funny because I actually changed the ending of the book Feisty in my chapter because it talks about how I was wrongfully incarcerated as a way to silence me in a domestic violence case in family courts.
Mm.
And I changed the ending because my youngest is 19 and I'm still dealing with the courts and I'm
Yeah.
paying the child support. And he started using the system. And I saw what Amber was going for. And I go, oh my God, 17 years, 300,000. I'm not a wealthy person like she is. And this is exactly why women don't speak out. This is exactly why all this stuff, I saw it clear as day. And the
Mm.
backlash, because I experienced that similar backlash, not to the obviously to the
Yeah.
degree, but locally here, like I lost friends. I had my name published in the paper, not like published like in an article, but it's like the discrediting was like insanely like I had to have done. I've had police departments. Well, you had to have done something wrong.
Mm.
No, like, what did you do? Like, I go, I guess if you want to say if I did anything wrong, is I ignored my instincts and I married a man who had red flags and he stole my life.
Mm.
That's if you want to say what did I do wrong, that's what I did wrong.
Yeah.
So seeing you and your work, wow. I mean, just to give folks a little bit of background, Dr. Jess Taylor is the director of Victim Focus in the UK. She is the author of multiple books. I know about Sexy But Psycho, how the patriarchy uses women's trauma against them. And then the latest one, the indicative, I couldn't wait to get this before I went to Ireland, the trauma indicative impact manual to kind of reframe, because I think we forget like a lot of the stuff in the mental health field in our society, right, is based on what? I interviewed a colleague of mine about a year ago who was recovering from breast cancer, and it was all on the topic of how the burning times of witches influence white women culture today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, wow, those root systems, right?
Mm.
And so seeing your work really is inspiring, and I'm hoping that women who are listening to this are also inspired to take your lead and also continue to speak up and address these things, right? So one of my questions is like, how did you, because I think so many folks stay silent, right? Why? Out of fear of backlash, losing friends, losing jobs, losing their security blankets, right?
Mm.
Who am I to speak out? I'm a nobody, right? What what got you started to be that voice? Like what led you? What was that trigger or incident in your life or whatever you saw or witnessed that made you want to become that voice, that disruptor?
It was lots of different things. I don't think there was one thing. I think that I I don't really know. I say this to my to close friends and family all the time when I'm reflecting on it, that I don't really know how I ended up the way I am, because I didn't have any good role models. I didn't have anybody encouraging it. I didn't have anybody that I was copying. I didn't have any, like, I was just, I don't know, I've always been like this. So like when I was 9, was I 9? If I might have been 10, but no, I'm gonna, no, yeah, 9 or 10 years old. I remember I was in, I went into a new school, and the bullying of these of other children was just, I couldn't bear to watch it, and it was so bad that I went to the head of my year in my new school and said, I think we should set up like a peer mentor and like buddy program. I think that the children need, to be able to form friendships outside of this like toxic stuff. And I remember the teacher was like, what? Like, and I remember just being, I think I know how to set it up. Let me try and set it up. And they were like, you're 10 or whatever. But she was really nice, and she let me do that. And on a, I think it was 2 afternoons a week, I had this little room that I could use in her classroom, where she had her like sandwiches in the afternoon, and and we put posters everywhere, and I got a couple of other children that wanted to do it with me, and anybody who was feeling unsafe in the school, and anybody who just needed somewhere safe to be with people that would talk to them and just make them feel safe, they could come to us and do that. And then my teacher like went to the local news, and there was the journalist came in and interviewed me about setting this thing up. And I was like,
And you were how old? 9 years old?
I think I was in year 5 in the UK, so that, I think that makes me 10.
10.
I think.
Wow.
And I'm trying to remember, but yeah, it is. I did have that newspaper cutting for ages, actually. I must try and find it, but I just remember, for me, I just thought that was the most obvious thing to do, and I know that it was seen as, I don't know, like quite an outlandish, I don't know, like a confident, disruptive thing to have developed and done. And then the school actually carried that on for years, even after I left. So I went all the way through the school years and left, and they carried on, and they made it into an actual system, like a support system for students. But I don't really know. There's so many things. Like, I've had loads of my own personal traumas and my own things that have happened to me that have spurred me on, but actually, in terms of why and how I think I ended up this, loud, or maybe like confident in what I'm doing, is actually that I have a real trigger around injustice. I have a real issue around injustice.
Maybe that's where I identify with you hugely, because it is a trigger for me too. And it's been that way my whole life too.
I just can't, I can't walk past it. I can't ignore it. I can't ignore when systems are clearly oppressive. I can't ignore. I really, really struggle with lack of fairness, lack of justice, lack of equality, and it's followed me all through everything I've ever done, and it triggers me personally. So like from a proper, deep, personal sort of place, but also it really bothers me in that sort of professional, global, societal, community sort of space as well, which is that if I see something and it very, very clearly looks and feels to me like an injustice and unfair, or a form of oppression, or a form of controlling people, or a form of gaslighting people, I can't not say something, because it makes me so uncomfortable. And I think it's that ultimately, that even when I don't really want to say something, even when I'm tired, even when it's too much, even when I know that I'm just going to get months and months of backlash for it, I just can't sit on it.
Jess, it's fascinating just listening to you talk about this, because for the longest time, I felt like I was a lone fish in an open sea. As I mentioned to you prior to the podcast, like, I was incarcerated. I wasn't incarcerated for doing anything wrong. I was incarcerated because I thought, I was raised that if you tell the truth shall prevail, justice shall prevail. We've got all these systems. And here's this judge granting custody to documented rapists, pedophiles, and domestic abusers. And I was contacted by a national media outlet at the time, and nothing came out of that. But I said to myself, if they reached out to me, I must be onto something. Okay. And then talking to a local lawyer who does constitutional work, she said she couldn't get involved because if she did, because it's family court, she would get disbarred. But she told me how to address these things. And she's very vocal now in the ERA front in the United States. And so, I started looking at the patterns and started seeing something just so insidious. And I just said, how am I, and I think the one case that really was worse than mine, I mean, I still haven't seen my kids since 2011, but that's still not going to stop me. That's not going to stop me. And I think the case that drove me was this one case that I sat with them. They said it was the father was sexually abusing the children, and the boy, who was 6 at the time, tried to kill himself, tried to jump out of a therapist's window. And, seeing the pictures that this kid was drawing, I mean, it was irrefutable. It was not he was coached. It was irrefutable. Then you've got all the medical reports. And you know what the judge said on record? If I ever see you're lying, you'll never see your son again. And the father had full 50-50 custody of this child. And that actually was the driving case for me. Like, I think we all have like this drive, like you see this injustice. And now I'm trying to find this balance, because I said, we also need money to be able to fight injustice. I'm recognizing that, right? We need the money also. We can't just have the passion. We also need the financial resources.
Yeah.
But, in writing, like, Sexy But Psycho, what was the inspiration? Like, because that, I think, was also the book that really kind of caught my attention too. Like, Sexy But Psycho, this, how the patriarchy uses women's trauma against them. Like, what made you want to write that book? What was the catalyst?
So I had already written Why Women Are Blamed for Everything. That was the first book that had gone like big. And I didn't really get to go into detail in Why Women Are Blamed for Everything, about the way that, so Why Women Are Blamed for Everything is about the psychology of victim blaming women and how we do that in every different like layer of society. And there is one little section in there on mental health, but I didn't really get to do what I wanted because it was in a broader sort of sense that I was talking about it. But in terms of the catalyst and, why I wanted to write the book and what actually caused that, I was working, so I'm 33 this autumn, and I've been doing this, I've been working in these forensic settings since I was 19. So it's 14 years at the end of this year. And
could you explain what that means to people that may not know what that is, just in case?
So I worked in, for example, rape and sexual abuse centres. I worked in the criminal justice system supporting victims and witnesses. I worked in the vulnerable and intimidated witness programme. I've worked in anti-human trafficking, child sexual abuse and exploitation and things like that. So in terms of, I guess, where I was at that particular time was that I was working in a sexual violence centre where we had waiting lists that were hundreds and hundreds of clients long. And I supervised about 30 odd counsellors and therapists. And I remember, sort of doing their supervision and meeting with them and sort of, giving them advice. I was training them up and things like that. And over again, they were just saying the same things. They're like, oh, I've got this new client. She was raped a few months ago. She's got borderline personality disorder. And then it'd be like the next one's like, oh, I've got this new client. She was abused in childhood. She's got borderline personality disorder. And then it was just borderline personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. And I was like, that can't be right. I mean, statistically, it can't even be that common. So why do we hold hundreds and hundreds of female victims of borderline personality disorder? And I was like asking people, and everyone was like, nobody could really give me an answer. I was only probably about 23 or 24, and I was sort of, nobody had really ever thought about it in any critical way. Everyone was like, well, they just have borderline personality disorder. I was like, what? That doesn't make sense to me. So what I did one night was that I got all the cases out of the filing cabinet and I sat on the floor and read them all. And I was like, how the hell have hundreds of women and girls got the same diagnosis in the same short time period? And I was reading the case records and I was reading the histories of all of these women and girls. And it was just all the same thing. It was that at some point somebody had told them to go to their GP or to a nurse because they were, you know, struggling, having nightmares, or they were feeling depressed or whatever it was. They'd referred them to the community mental health team, and the mental health team had diagnosed them all with borderline personality disorder, because usually what we know is it's 7 times more likely to be diagnosed in women, and it's about 20 times more likely in women who've been abused. So I didn't know that at the time. So I was just like, what? That can't be right. And then I started getting irritated by it, because what would happen is professionals would come and see us or talk to us or meet us, and they'd be like, well, you know, there's nothing much you can really do for her. You know, she's got a personality disorder. You know, she doesn't engage well in services. She's not willing to look at her role in the abuse. And I was just like, whoa, hang on a minute. You know, like I started to sort
You're
of
speaking my language, because as I'm not a like licensed mental health professional, but I grew up in a family of osteopathic physicians and nurses. I do what I call spiritually based integrative holistic health, mostly in Japan, where it was used as a therapy.
yeah.
And what I learned was I started seeing like the similar patterns, but I'm like, I'm not a doctor, you know? And I do know, like I did learn from some of the trauma training, that if you're on like antipsychotics, antidepressants for more than a year, it changes the brain chemistry, all those things, right? Where you might end up becoming dependent on it and never getting off. That's a whole nother topic for another day. But I started seeing similar things, and I go, because I noticed even with myself, I go, I don't have this, but I do know, like when I'm in the courthouse, I am a different person than when I am here. How is that a mental health issue and not a trigger trauma response?
Yeah.
And I had enough awareness, and then I started seeing the similar pattern in other women, and that's probably what led me down my path, right? So, and I always questioned, because I always said that the men are going to want to torment you, to make you look crazy, so they can then use the courts and the system against you.
Yeah,
Right?
and that was my experience essentially. So once your eyes are open to it, there's not really, you can't like close them again. And so I went and worked, after I worked with adult women who'd been, you know, raped and abused, I actually then moved into a national management position where I was working with in child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation and trafficking of children. And I remember thinking, well, you know, at least in this new job, I won't have to deal with the constant victim blaming and labeling of children, because who would blame, you know, an 11-year-old for being trafficked and raped? And actually what happened was that the victim blaming was exactly the same, and that nobody cared they were children. And so especially girls of like 10, 11, 12 years old, you know, being positioned as promiscuous, as asking for it, as risk takers. And
Can I just say for a second, for those who are listening, what you are addressing is like, this is why I think the first sentence, the second sentence of our podcast, the elephant in the room. This is the things that everybody knows, but nobody talks about, or we're so burnt out, so tired, so exhausted, or we have, you know, there's this hustle culture that doesn't allow us to really see what's going on. Or if we do, we're too exhausted or we're afraid. This is right here, what you are addressing. I can't, for those of you who are watching or listening, you may want to rewind and re-listen again to what she is saying. Go ahead. Sorry. I just had to say that because I feel like what you are addressing, I have been dreaming. I've been going on in my case, just my case alone for 18 years. I have never heard any professional talk the way you talk about the things that I know that I've been shamed for because I've spoken out. And so this, I can't say how, thank you, Jess, for really bringing and tying these connections and tying these dots together, because your impact is immense. So thank you. So go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I felt like I needed to just make that point.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I can't actually remember what I was talking about. Oh, I was talking about when I was working with children. It was like, and it is really about connecting dots. I believe that. I think that, so my expertise and my PhD was in the psychology of victim blaming. And it was once I realized that victim prejudice and victim blaming, the hatred of women and girls and the hatred of victims of abuse specifically, goes hand in hand with psychiatry and psychology and the mental health industry, because the quickest, most effective way of silencing those women and girls is going to be to suggest that they're mentally ill, that they have a personality disorder, that there's something specific about their brain or their brain chemistry or something like that, that means that they're not credible, that they are problematic, they're manipulative, they're liars. And
can we also add, this is what I learned from the trauma industry too. I remember seeing this one statistic and it blew me away. From the day Prozac was introduced on the market to how many prescriptions from the time it was introduced to the parallels of how many people are now mentally disabled, parallels to the amount of prescriptions, to the amount of people that are on disability. And that even some of the trauma experts are getting blasted too, because they're saying, they're challenging, this isn't a brain chemistry issue, it's a nervous system issue. It's a trauma issue.
It's not brain chemistry, and we know it isn't, because we've just recently had the meta-analysis by Professor Joanna Moncrief, which has found that there is no evidence of chemical imbalances in the brain that cause mental health issues. It's a myth. But you know, the American Psychiatric Association have been saying that for nearly 10 years. They just don't say it out loud. They don't say it to the general public. There's never been a public retraction. You've got huge pharmaceutical companies making billions a year off selling these drugs that they know are not targeting brain chemical imbalances, because they don't exist. We don't have any genes. We've never ever found a gene responsible or even that causes predispositions of mental disorders of any kind. Like, a lot of what we talk about in mental health and in psychiatry and psychology is myth. It's disproven. It's not even that we're like, we're not sure. It's actually completely disproven, and we just carry on and we just feed everybody the same shit. And
doesn't it go back to like how women were hysterical? So like back in the, and we had to throw them in the psych ward because they were just unhappy in their marriages, and they were beaten or whatever. They were just diagnosed with hysteria, right?
Yeah, because like, in the same way that it's connected to the witch trials, if somebody said she's a witch, then you would be tried as a witch. And then obviously there's no way of surviving a witch trial. So like between 700,000 and 1.3 million women were murdered in the witch trials in 300 years, which is genocide. But we don't even talk about that. We don't, like, because it's just women, isn't it? So now I've
actually heard stats as high as 9 million with that. Really? Like, you know, I think I heard up to 9 million. I guess it depends on where the data is, because we don't have concrete data, because the church ruled it all, right? Which is a whole nother, like these are all these layers, right? These are all the intersectionality that keeps women suppressed and oppressed. And like right now, the women have been having voices, and the more we have voices, now we have a war going on with the war on women. Like we're losing rights on our healthcare, we're losing rights in all these different areas, and it's scary.
Yeah, it is. And you're absolutely right as well. Even though people don't want to talk about it, the church had an incredible influence over psychiatry and psychology for a very long time. And actually, the church still has influence over psychiatry and psychology. You know, there's a reason why we still see the echoes and the control. You know, for example, you know, it was the church that set up the insane asylums. It was the church that connected religion to psychiatry. It was the church that suggested people had mental sicknesses that could be cured by converting to Christianity. So
let's keep going there, because this comes to the spiritual piece. Please continue.
Well, so
bring it.
This sort of stuff fascinates me, because I also it's interesting because I'm on my own sort of very personal journey of understanding what is meant globally and personally by spirituality versus organized religion, you know, and the control of organized religion and the oppression of that versus what it means to understand your own sort of self and what your purpose is and what your journey is and things like that, and, you know, that kind of thing. But I think that we really don't want to almost like lift that lid on how much control religion has had and still does have.
We're seeing it in the States because of the evangelical right and the money they've been seeding for 50 years. It's coming to light now, you know, so that it's like a chess match, and then they're going checkmate, 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 like all the people they just put into Supreme Court, which is scary, you know, and it's coming from the evangelical right.
Yeah, it's it's what's interesting as well is that in the UK, for example, our most recent census that we do found that the vast majority of the UK is actually atheist, but our institutions are all Christian and have Christian or Catholic leaning. But we're now at way over, I think it's just under 60% of the UK public report that they're atheists. They don't have an organized religion and they don't worship at all. But that doesn't mean that religion isn't having control, because like, I mean, religion had control of psychiatry. That's why misogyny was there, because the church fed that through. You know, it was the same reason that homophobia was fed through psychology, psychiatry, and mental health. It was the same reason that
witches were burned, right?
yeah, the witches were burned for that reason. You know, and like just an interesting like aside, like as an example, the church burned and murdered midwives because they put out propaganda deliberately and said that only men could be given the gift of medical knowledge by God. So if a woman had any medical knowledge, she must have been given it by Satan. And on that basis, if a woman had any knowledge about obstetrics, about birth, about pregnancy, about menstruation, anything like that, that would be enough to have you killed. And so even though the midwives were the ones that were helping couples get pregnant, they were helping even like kings and queens and like, you know, the rich people have babies and have sons and whatever it is they were trying to do. The midwives always towed this line that was like terrifying, because if they did something wrong, you know, say for example the woman had a miscarriage, they'd just say the midwife was a witch, and they would say, well, you caused that miscarriage to happen because you're evil, you know. But they would on the sly be using her knowledge to be like, when is my wife going to ovulate? When do we need to have sex in order to have a baby? And so midwives, I think, still are almost seen as at the bottom of the rung, in like the bottom rung of like the sort of hierarchy of knowledge about women.
We also murdered like warriors, leaders, because women were also in leadership politically, in the military. They were side by side with the men. Like we talk a lot about it in, you know, I think it was episode 6, The Burning Times of Witches, in the podcast, for those who want to check that out to tie this all in. But I think I said in that podcast, can you imagine 500 years of conditioning in our DNA? Like, let's like, can we just like sit with that for a minute of like, all of that happened to the women that were persecuted, the leaders, the warriors, the midwives, the medicine women, right?
Yeah.
And the fear that was literally bred into us over what, 500 years, how that impacts. Like, I always wonder, I had to sit and wonder, like, why didn't I like that woman? I have no reason to not like that woman. I don't know why I don't like that woman. And then I had to like sit and think, like, now that I have the knowledge, and I go, is that why? Is it because we have been bred and like in our conditioning, like genetically, like, you know, not through a DNA and like, you know, all those things we say energetically that's passed on, right? And like, is that why? You know, I like, I don't know, these are all questions, right? Like, because my thing is, we have to know the root issue, or do we, to know how to fix it and how to change it.
See, I don't know, because I don't know how I feel about sort of suggesting that it's like genetic, but what I do know is that you're absolutely right that we've been conditioned for hundreds of years, and that conditioning has only got more and more intelligent, and now has got more and more successful, especially with the internet, social media and technology, and the control of the mainstream media and things like that. And I think that we are living in times where the ruling elite have figured out how to completely manipulate entire populations in like 5 minutes using social media. All they've got to do is release misinformation, misdirect us, divert us, or even pit us against each other with a set of fake headlines or fake news or whatever it is, and they're learning how to do it. So they've already
saw that with Amber Heard, right? We saw Amber Heard is a perfect example of that.
And they paid for thousands and thousands of bots, thousands and thousands of,
didn't they have like 9 million bots or something like that?
Yeah, it was absolutely incredible. And, you know, look at the fact that, so like, even if you took the Amber's case as an example, there was literally a handful of women like me that were speaking out. There was at one point, there was about 5 of us, and that was it. And
I was one of them. I was there, but
it was tiny though, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was absolutely tiny amount.
It was exhausting. It was
Yeah.
exhausting. I even had, because I was looking for a new office to move my office, and the woman, something came up. As I said, I run women's circles, especially like with domestic violence. Something came up about Amber Heard, and I said, yeah, what a tragedy, you know, it's, and she goes, oh, Johnny Depp, how dare you? And she like was she undermined my contract for my new space.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, there were, for example, in the UK, we have a really quite powerful feminist sort of network and movement. And you know what? They didn't say shit about Amber Heard. They did not stick their neck out. There was virtually nobody saying anything. Of all the women that I expected, of all the CEOs of the women's services, all the CEOs of domestic violence services, sexual violence services,
same here in the States,
didn't say shit.
They did after the fact, but they didn't do it during.
Yeah.
And, you know, I sat there because I was feeling it and I was experiencing it too, you know, and I just said, Laura, you know, and I kept saying to myself, Laura, is this really wise to keep like doing this when you just published one book, you're getting ready to publish another, and are you putting the nail in your coffin? And I said, no, like, that's what my whole book is about. Like, it's about staying in your truth. It's about speaking truth to power. It's about dismantling that, because if you want to become whole, you have to be able to address the root systems and the root issues, right?
Yeah.
And if you're not getting better, then you've done everything else, and maybe you have to look back at, is it the cultural conditioning? You know, is it the hustle culture? Is it all those other things that web, right? And I just remember sitting there going like, I was just, know what I was blown away by more than anything is how many survivors of domestic violence or so-called victims were trauma bonding with Johnny Depp.
Yep.
And they were so vile about it. And I'm sitting there going like, you don't have the right to, if you're a victim, then you know what it feels like to be emotionally, verbally, and you know, assaulted. How dare you speak to me in those terms if you claim to be a victim, because you should be sympathetic.
Yeah, but the thing is about that is that when we do psychological studies, we actually don't find any difference in empathy or in victim blaming attitudes, even when women have been raped and abused. So there's an assumption made that when women have been abused or raped or whatever it is that's happened to them, that they'll have higher empathy and less victim blaming attitudes towards other women and girls. But most studies show that there's no difference whatsoever. So women who have been raped, they've been abused, will victim blame at the same rate as anyone else. And also they'll have lower levels of empathy. But some studies, more recent studies, have actually shown that some women who have been abused will actually victim blame other women more, because it keeps them psychologically safe to almost differentiate themselves.
I was going to ask you about that. Like, what could be the mechanism that would drive that, you know?
There's a couple of different theories that we teach, which is, one of them is like around psychological safety and perceived control, that if you can tell yourself that that victim's bad, that woman deserved it, that woman must have done something wrong, you can sort of tell yourself, yeah, but I wouldn't have done that in her situation. So I saw a lot of that happening where women...
Yeah, and I also saw she couldn't have been abused because mine was worse.
Yes, so there was that. And then the other thing that I saw a lot of was, well, I know she's lying, because when I was a victim of domestic violence, I didn't say this and I didn't do that. So she obviously isn't a real victim, because when I was a real victim, I said this and did that and told this person and reported it to the police, but she didn't. So she's not a real victim.
Do you think it's more of like them trying to also seek validation for their own? So they have to, so it's like going back to the witch trials, right? It's like they're hanging Amber out to basically try to save themselves in a way, right? Like, you know, I don't know, like
there was some of that. I mean, so I was asked to work on the case by Amber's team. So they got in touch partway through, and then I supported them as much as I could, and I was on the phone a lot, and Amber obviously really struggled. It was horrific. And then we met, me and Jamie supported them as much as we could from behind the scenes, and then we met with Amber, and after it had finished, on my birthday actually, and we met up and spent some time together, and just it was quite emotional, because we'd all been through so much and it had been going on for so long, and it was just so hard to, that for everybody else she was just a caricature, she was a meme, she was entertainment. That whole case was entertainment, but to us she was a real human being. She was like somebody that we cared about, and somebody that we were trying to keep safe, and that was essentially, like, Johnny Depp told her he was going to destroy her globally. He called it, what was it, global annihilation or something, or humiliation or something.
Right, and that he was going to murder her, strangle her, whatever, burn her body beyond recognition, and and fuck her, right?
Yeah,
and I always said to people, so if the case is about defamation, let's just take out whether or not Amber Heard did anything. Let's just cut that out for sake of legal argument, right?
Yep.
Doesn't matter what she did. This is about whether or not he did anything.
Yeah.
The fact that he said that, I said, who in their right mind goes to that level of graphic detail of how they're going to murder and screw a dead body, unless they're so unfucking stable and violent?
I'd made the same comment, because I remember people were arguing with me about it online. I was doing a lot of press, I was doing a ton of interviews, I was knackered, and I remember I said the same thing. I was like, if this dude is apparently innocent and he's a victim of domestic violence, what I can tell you now is that for over a decade of working in this sector, I have never seen a victim of domestic violence fantasize about burning a body and raping it. I was like, what I have seen is a ton of perpetrators talk like that. I know how perpetrators talk, and I know that that's how they talk about women. So I agree with you. And, I made the same comments, and I remember somebody commenting, well, several people commented back and said, oh, so have you never said something that you like that when you were angry? I was like, no, I have never said anything like that I
don't know anybody normal that says. So this is where we've also normalized abuse, right?
Yes,
we've normalized that you can say whatever the fuck you want on social media. This isn't a social media post that you just fucking lashed up because you're hiding behind a screen here, which is still wrong. But even if you did say that, then honey, you got a problem.
Yeah, for sure.
And maybe you need a therapist, right? Like maybe you need some mental health. Like, it's really like the level. I think I posted something on Twitter the other day because I was watching here another mass shooting. Like, it seems to be rampant here, right? But I think this was also in Texas. And they said, well, yeah, the guy had mental health. And I think I put a thing on Twitter like, I am so sick and tired of the media and politicians labeling violence, rage, I forget what else I put in there, like, as mental health. I go, when it is misogyny, patriarchy, white supremacy, male supremacy, like, I listed all those things. That is not mental health.
No, it's not. That's another thing I think is really important about, the messages that I'm trying to get across, is that I completely agree with you. I think it's appalling that we constantly, every single day, reframe the choices of perpetrators, violent abusers, rapists, murderers, dictators, like, as mental health. Like, this isn't a mental health issue. This isn't something. And why I'm so strong on that is because I said this to police. I've been training a lot of police officers recently. I do a lot of work in police forces.
Oh, that's wonderful.
We were talking about one of the detectives on the murder team put their hand up and said, well, 9 out of 10 of all of our murderers have mental health issues. And I was like, I don't think it's a mental health issue. And she was like, well, why not? And I said, well, put it this way. I would argue that society has groomed thousands, millions of people into normalizing and accepting extreme violence, not only normalizing and accepting it, but sensationalizing violence and abuse. And we've done that on purpose, and that has been being done to us on purpose. So we now have kids playing games where they murder people in the game, and it's a game that
we just had a mass shooting where a 12-year-old pulled up with an AK-47 and shot somebody at a Sonic drive-through, murdered him. 12 years old.
And they'll claim that's mental illness and that they've got not capacity and all that sort of stuff. But the thing is, if we live in a society where the films are all about murder, the games are all about murder, our dramas are all about murder, our favorite books are all about murder, like, we're being fed this level of abuse and violence. And we're seeing the same, like, look at the fact that we glorify and sensationalize serial killers. They're getting their own fucking TV programs now. Every serial killer there's ever been has got their own series.
I boycotted all of that because I said, I'm a big thing. If I'm going to talk my talk, I have to walk it. Yes. That means I do not put my money that supports abusers.
Yeah.
And stop.
Yeah.
And stop.
I agree. It's the same, because I made the same decision about porn years ago. Like, I am completely anti-porn, and in order to be anti-porn, you have to lead from the front, and that means never watching it, never supporting it, and it's this, it's the same thing. And I don't do that from any religious or conservative perspective. I do it from the fact that our entire
it's demeaning women.
It's exploiting and killing women. Like, our, for it, like, there's so many interesting statistics even about that industry, which is that there's some statistics that say that, a certain proportion, if you go online now and go on like Pornhub and watch porn, that there is a certain proportion at any one time between, I think it's like 1.25% of all porn films, porn videos that you'll watch, where the actresses are dead. And they're dead because the mortality rate of them is so severely impacted by that industry that they die from drug overdose, suicide, illnesses, diseases. And so, porn lasts forever, but they don't. They're expendable. They're just sort of like, they just run through these human beings and get what they want out of them, exploit them, drug them up. The sort of real side of that industry, it isn't talked about. So, like, it's similar for me, really, is that, like, there are things in life where if you're going to boycott them, you have to actually do something. You can't just be like a keyboard warrior on the internet being like, oh, I don't like this. Do something about it. Do you know what I mean?
So that kind of goes to this, right? So, like, this indicative trauma impact manual, tell me what inspired you to write that.
Okay, so we've talked quite a bit, haven't we, about like mental health just now and like psychiatry and so on. And everything in psychiatry, psychiatric disorders, comes from a book called the DSM. And the American Psychiatric Association owns the DSM, writes the DSM, publishes the DSM, and they sell hundreds of millions of copies of that worldwide. And it is essentially what controls and leads all mental health industries. So everything from, the way mental health is used in law, all the way through to how it's used in, I don't know, schools, for example. So everything you've ever heard about mental health comes from the DSM. So things like anxiety disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder is all from this manual that they created in the 50s and then update it. And there's never been an alternative, because the DSM literally has monopoly. There are no alternative manuals. There are no other ways of thinking about this. So me and Jamie, my wife, we co-authored ITIM together, and we wanted to create a handbook, a manual that just didn't have any disorders labeling or myth or generalizations or oppressive language in it at all. But what we wanted to create was like an A to Z of like, look at all these potential traumas that you could be subjected to. This is what they mean, and this is how they're going to impact you. And then in the next chapter, it's like A to Z of hundreds of different trauma responses, coping mechanisms, emotions, thought processes that you are going to go through because of those traumas and distressing experiences in your life. And so people can just pick it up, and they're like, we wanted them to sort of be able to go, you know, ever since that happened to me, I'm always like apologizing for myself. Why is that? And then be able to flick to like A and be like, oh, that's why I do that. And then be like, well, you know, also ever since this happened to me, you know, whenever I get scared, I have these huge palpitations. Why does that happen? Flick to that and be able to like look at the physiological things, rather than being like, this plus this plus this equals you have a mental disorder. We wanted to be able to provide all that information, but with no diagnosis at the end of it.
Yeah,
So,
I found it very, honestly, I am a horrible reader. Like I've always have been. I think this was the fastest book I went through in the shortest period of time.
that's awesome.
It's, yeah, I mean, and it's very laid out well, whether you're talking to the layperson who may have been a victim of some form of trauma, somebody who might be battling chronic illness, who never really thought about the link to because that's where that's where my book is associated with. It's the link between chronic illness and trauma.
Yeah.
And so who might be battling that, but never thought, or maybe thought to look at, maybe it's a trauma response, right? It's the physiological somatic response. Or, you know, licensed professionals that never really thought about, because they came from a schooling and licensing that was very patriarchal to begin with and very pharmaceutical led,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
know. So I thank you so much for all the work that you've done. I mean, I can't tell you how much in the last 20 years of me doing this work, how I prayed for more people like you on the planet. So tell me 3 things, like somebody who, whether, and you can frame it however you feel fit, whether it's somebody who's a bystander witnessing, like whether it's Amber Heard or stuff like that, or somebody who is a survivor of abuse, or even a professional. What are 3 actionable steps they can do to create a change today?
I think the first one is something that I've been working on a lot for years, and I think it changed my life years ago. I think I'm at like my peak at sort of like at the moment. I'm proud of it. Is genuinely ask yourself, are you adding more toxicity to the world? Are you harming people? Because it's all right sort of looking at ourselves as victims of things, but what harm are we adding? Like, what are we doing? You know, are we a gossip? Are we the type of person that says horrible things behind somebody's back? Are we the person that looks at somebody that's done something amazing and thinks, bitch? Do you know what I mean? Like all these horrible ways that we live in the world, and the energy that we're carrying with us all the time. Who are you? Look at yourself. Like, are there ways that you could process your own shit so you stop putting it on other people? Like that, it's been one of the most important things I think I've ever done. And I think that it's something that I was talking to somebody the other day about. I want to feel at peace about what I did whilst I was here on this planet. And part of that is knowing that I have not, and I've made an active choice to not cause more harm, not add to toxicity, not to hurt somebody when I've got power over them or whatever it is. So like that's one thing, is you need to start looking at, you want to change things, change yourself. Like look in the mirror and do whatever you can for yourself first. And then I would say the second thing is relevant to everything we've just spoken about. You need to stop talking about yourself as if you're mentally ill. Don't use language like, oh, my anxiety is playing up, or like, oh, I'm really like, you know, my depression's come back, or like, oh, I'm a bit borderline, I'm a bit bipolar. Don't feed into the narrative. Like you have to shake it off. It's not real. This is a psychiatric language that is so embedded now that you know, we're calling each other psychos and sociopaths and stuff. Like, listen to yourself. This isn't accurate.
We do that, like when I do my one-on-one work and people say, oh, I feel anxious, right? When I try to get them into the body, and I go, well, that's a label. What are you actually feeling?
Yeah.
And I go, and where are you feeling it, right? So like, this is like some of the work I do in helping people process things, right? Yeah. And then they find out, like I had one of the stories I talk about in the book was I was working with this young girl, you know, recovering from sort of abusive situation. And she had a lot of fear, anxiety, all these different things. And she came in one day and she was full of anger and rage. And I said, okay, so what's happened? She goes, I fucking hate my cousin. And I said, well, hate's a very strong word. Let's just reframe that. Right. And I go, and I did this whole exercise about where is it in the body, you know, and all those sensations. To make a long story short, she learned that it wasn't that she hated her cousin. It was that she didn't know how to process that her cousin crossed a boundary with her, pushing down a religious objective, maybe in good, you know, whatever they thought they were doing good, right? But she didn't have the vocabulary or the tools to know how to say, nope, put a boundary down. I don't care. I love you, whatever. This is not right for me. So it's easy to put the guillotine down. I hate, right? And instead of recognizing what is the real issue. And when we were able to reframe it, I said, okay, where's your anxiety? Where's your fear? Within 60 seconds, it was gone.
Yes.
Literally. And I said to them, I tell my clients, every time we have those, just remember this experience, because you're going to get triggered. Things are going to come back. But you know, don't ever think that you can't do it because you just did it here.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so you're so right on. And going back to your first one, we have a teaching called Kodatama, and it means words have spiritual power. It's a Japanese teaching. And it's more than just the words, right? And I used to go back and forth with my teachers because in the book I was going to compare it. How do I explain this to Western mindsets when it's a Japanese Shinto kind of teaching? And in my Japanese teachers, you know, saying, comparing it to maybe gaslighting, right? People, how they get affected by gaslighting. And they go, no, it's not gaslighting. They're all like, but I go, but how do I get people to understand that it's not just the word you say? It's like, it's that energy, right? It's like, you know, when people gaslight, there's like a rage, there's like an anger, there's an energy behind it. So, but with the Japanese, they understand Kodatama. It's more or less like I always understood, like, why don't they ever just say no to me if they don't want to say no, right? It'll be, I'll just think about it, because they're so consciously aware they don't want to put that negative energy out, because they believe it so strong that when they pass or they leave an area, they leave an energetic imprint behind. And it's fascinating because when we look at that in the body, right, and how we process that, and then it becomes infectious. So you're so on. Third point, I didn't mean to.
It's all right. Actually, I was just listening. Third point of something that you can do, like like you're saying, like change that you can make immediately. I think is to be aware, like to really like commit to your own education and development. Nobody is going to educate you. Nobody's coming to save you. You're living in a very hierarchical, very controlled, very patriarchal, capitalistic, racist world. Like that's what we live in. That's what's happening to all of us. That's what we are right now. It's moving more and more right wing. Like you are getting constantly bombarded with fake shit that isn't real, you know, things to distract you, things to almost like lower your level of development all the time. And so I think that you can commit to your own well-being and development and education.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, right? I mean, it's, you know, I think we spend half of our life packing or accumulating things, and we spend the second half of our life unpacking and getting rid of things. And I think we are in times, you know, like the more I unpack things, you know, the more I see clear. You know, like I just came back from Ireland and I was getting ready to put a post together, you know, talking about some of the things I'm integrating, you know, and the family and sense of community of the people that I'm associated with there is something that we don't have here in the States. And it's not something that I can try to put into words or try to explain how it's different. What I do see, being somebody who was born American, is only other way I can see it as I've seen it in the BIPOC communities, and I've seen it with the immigrant populations. The level of family and community is so strong. And, you know, we used to have this saying, alone we're strong, but together we're stronger. You know, and women especially have been conditioned and raised for 500 years to pit one against another for the white man, especially the white British man, right? That's where it kind of all started, to be at the hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
And if we can just maybe pause for a moment, take a step back and see how are we contributing to that level of misogyny. Or I always say, like, we all have misogyny. We all
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
patriarchy.
Yeah.
It's where is it embedded? When people get
Yeah.
defensive, I go, look, we all have it. I go,
Yeah.
the thing is, I used to think about women and how I used to judge women. I'm not even close to the same person I was 30 years ago. I look back and I go, wow. But I can see how I was to know how to say, I can see through that lens now of why, and know how to maybe hopefully shift, right? That's how we know we're unpacking things, right? We're unpacking our own inner biases, because our school systems, our churches, our communities, our governments, our health systems are all embedded on a suppressive, oppressive system.
Yeah.
You know, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate you and your work. How is the best way for people to follow you or to reach out to you?
My handles on social media, so Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, I'm even on LinkedIn as well. I'm on TikTok as well. It's all the same. It's at Dr. Jess Taylor, all one word. So that's pretty simple. But also we have tons of free trauma-informed resources. We have free courses for anybody that wants to process their sexual trauma, and also anybody who wants to process their feelings about sex and intimacy after they've been raped or abused. And that's all at victimfocus.com.
Well, thank you so much. And your work is so needed in the world today. So I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for those listening, make sure again that you like, follow, share, do all those fun things. And if you want to support our mission, please become a Patreon member. Have a great day, everybody.